Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The silver clink of teaspoons against porcelain echoed through the opulent drawing-room of Ashworth Manor, a symphony of civility masking the tension simmering beneath. Lady Clarissa Ashworth, resplendent in emerald silk, presided over the afternoon tea with the regal detachment of a queen surveying her court. Her guests, a carefully curated mix of old money and new ambition, leaned into the ritual of cucumber sandwiches and gossip, their laughter brittle as the bone china in their hands. Miss Marbella, seated at the far end of the claw-footed mahogany table, observed the tableau with the quiet intensity of a barn owl. At 72, her lace-collared dress and silver-threaded bun rendered her invisible to the powerful, a miscalculation they often regretted. "1 lump or 2, miss?" Lady Clarissa's voice dripped honeyed condescension as she hovered the sugar tongs over the cup intended for her husband, Lord Reginald Ashworth. The man in question, ruddy-faced and already halfway through his third brandy despite the hour, scowled at his pocket watch. "Marbella," the detective replied, her tone as light as the bergamot-scented steam rising from her teacup. "And no sugar, thank you. I find bitterness clarifies the mind." A flicker of irritation crossed their hostess's face. The seating arrangement, Miss Marbella noted, was no accident. To Lady Clarissa's right sat Dr. Edmund Hale, the family physician, his manicured fingers drumming an arrhythmia against the tablecloth. Directly across, Miss Penelope Vane, a willowy heiress rumored to be the latest recipient of Lord Reginald's wandering attentions, paled as her teacup trembled in its saucer. The remaining guests, Mrs. Agatha Price, a vinegar-tongued dowager, and Mr. Charles Whitlock, a brash railroad magnate, leaned forward like vultures eyeing a weakening gazelle. The tragedy announced itself with a gasp. Lady Clarissa's hand flew to her throat, her emerald ring catching the light as if signaling distress. "Reginald, you!" she rasped, her accusation cut short as she collapsed face first into the tiered cake stand. Sandwiches and scones scattered like fallen soldiers. Chaos erupted. Dr. Hale sprang into action, rolling Lady Clarissa onto the Persian rug as brandy sloshed from Lord Reginald's glass onto his wife's silk bodice. "Fetch my medical bag," the physician barked at a footman. Miss Vane emitted a high, keening wail, while Mr. Whitlock muttered about bad clotted cream. Only Miss Marbella remained still, her gaze fixed on the overturned teacup leaking amber droplets onto the tablecloth. By nightfall, the manor had transformed into a gilded prison. Constable Briggs, his boyish face ill-suited to gravity, confirmed what the almond scent on Lady Clarissa's lips had already whispered. "Cyanide." "Suicide's the obvious answer," he declared, mopping his brow. "Marital troubles. Debts." "Debts?" Miss Marbella inquired, stirring her now cold tea. Lord Reginald's roar shook the crystal chandeliers. "Preposterous! The Ashworths are not in financial straits." Yet the way his eyes darted to the Titian painting above the mantel, sold last month to a Parisian collector, though the copy hanging in its place was masterful, told another story. Over the next hours, Miss Marbella wandered the crime scene like a benign ghost. In the drawing-room, she noted the peculiar placement of Lady Clarissa's chair, 6 inches farther from the table than the others, creating a clear line of sight to the terrace doors. In the kitchen she listened as the maid, red-eyed and trembling, confessed to losing her mother's garnet brooch that morning. Her ladyship threatened dismissal if it weren't found by sundown. The girl wept, but it was in the library, tracing a finger along the embossed spines of leather-bound ledgers, that Miss Marbella found the first thread. Between volumes of Byron and Blake lay a pharmacist's receipt dated 3 days prior for arsenic. Rats! Mrs. Price sniffed when confronted, her jet-buttoned morning dress already unpacked. The Manor's overrun. Though, if you ask me, Clarissa finally drove Reginald to— A crash interrupted her. Miss Vane stood in the doorway, a shattered vase at her feet. I never meant. The heiress fled, leaving Miss Marbella to pluck a torn love letter from the ceramic shards. My dearest Reggie, it began. When will you stop pretending? As midnight approached, the detective assembled the fragments. The arsenic purchase, too crude for a subtle killer. The financial rot beneath the Manor's gilded surface. The lovers' quarrels echoing down drafty corridors. And always, that teacup, Lady Clarissa's own, yet bearing faint lipstick smudges in two distinct shades. Retiring to her four-poster bed, Miss Marbella replayed the fatal moment. Lady Clarissa's outstretched hand, offering the cup to— no, receiving. It? The detective sat bolt upright, sugar tongs glinting. Miss Vane's chair angled toward Lord Reginald, Dr. Hales tapping fingers, counting seconds. Somewhere below, a floorboard creaked. The Titian copy tilted ever so slightly askew. Chapter 2. Webs of Silk and Lies. The storm that had threatened all day finally broke over Ashworth Manor, its fury rattling the leaded windows as if nature itself demanded entry into the locked-room mystery. Miss Marbella stood at the drawing-room's marble hearth, her reflection fractured in the gilded mirror above the mantel. Behind her, Constable Briggs paced like a caged terrier, his notebook bristling with half-formed theories. The arsenic receipt, he declared, jabbing a finger at the pharmacist's slip Miss Marbella had discovered. Mrs. Price claims she bought it for rats. But mark my words, that woman could poison a bishop and blame the sacramental wine. Miss Marbella said nothing, her attention fixed on the mirror's warped view of the tea table, still littered with congealing sandwiches. The positions of the cups, she noted, did not align with the guests' claimed seats. Lady Clarissa's chair, pulled slightly back, created a direct path to the terrace doors, a detail as deliberate as a chess move. Their silent study was interrupted by a howl from the hall. Lord Reginald Ashworth, his cravat undone and eyes bloodshot, slammed a decanter of brandy onto a side table. "This is your doing," he roared at Miss Vane, who cowered behind a potted fern. "Your theatrics, your letters, you have destroyed us." The heiress's porcelain cheeks flushed scarlet. "You swore you'd leave her," she whimpered, clutching the torn love letter Miss Marbella had discreetly returned to her earlier. "You said the Titian sale would settle the debts, and we would—" "Enough!" Dr. Hale's voice cut through the room like a scalpel. The physician stood in the doorway, his usually immaculate coat wrinkled, a smear of something dark on his cuff. "Must you air this sordidness while Clarissa lies cold in my surgery?" Miss Marbella observed the tableau. Lord Reginald's guilt, Miss Vane's desperation, Dr. Hale's poorly concealed rage. Only Mrs. Price seemed unperturbed, her knitting needles clicking a macabre rhythm as she muttered, "The Ashworths have always married for money and buried for freedom." By dawn, the household's secrets began to unravel like the fringe on Mrs. Price's shawl. In the frost-lightened gardens, Miss Marbella found the maid, Molly, digging beneath a rose-bush with dirt-caked hands. "It's me mum's brooch, miss," the girl sobbed, producing a tarnished garnet pin. "Her ladyship found it in Mr. Whitlock's overcoat yesterday. Said she would have me jailed for thieving if I didn't." She trailed off, eyes widening at the approaching crunch of boots. The railroad magnate himself materialized through the mist, his gold pocket watch glinting. "Plotting with the help, Miss Marbella?" he sneered. "Careful. Servants here have a habit of disappearing." But it was neither Molly nor Mr. Whitlock who concerned Miss Marbella as she retreated to the library. Spread across the oak desk were Lady Clarissa's personal effects, a monogrammed handkerchief, a key with a peculiar serrated edge, and a vial of lavender salts. The detective lifted the vial, noting the residue around its stopper, too crystalline for mere perfume. Admiring my wife's trinkets? Lord Reginald's shadow fell across the desk. Miss Marbella watched his Adam's apple bob as his gaze fixed on the key. "That's from her dressing case," he muttered. "Nothing of importance." "Then you won't mind if I borrow it," Miss Marbella replied, slipping the key into her pocket. As the lord spluttered, her eye caught the ledger lying open to a page marked Titian Sale, £22,000. Below, in cramped script, Debt to Vane Consortium, £25,000. The West Wing's air smelled of camphor and decay. Miss Marbella turned the serrated key in Lady Clarissa's dressing-room lock, revealing a trove of velvet boxes and bundled letters. Beneath a false drawer bottom, she found them, the cyanide ampules, neatly labeled for experimental use only, and stamped with Dr. Hale's clinic seal. She threatened to expose me. The physician's voice came from the doorway, strained but calm. "Last month, when I refused to certify Reginald's nervous condition to institutionalize him, Clarissa always kept souvenirs of her leverage." Miss Marbella studied the ampules. "Yet you didn't kill her." "No." Dr. Hale's laugh was bitter. "I have wanted to kill Reginald since he got my sister with child and abandoned her. But poison?" He shook his head. "Too kind for him." As the doctor retreated, Miss Marbella pieced together the timeline. The cyanide stolen weeks prior, the arsenic purchased days ago, the Titian sold, the debts still unpaid. And through it all, Lady Clarissa's teacup, the one she'd so pointedly not drunk from until. A memory surfaced, Miss Vane's nervous reach across the table as the sugar tongs clinked. "Let me, Lady Ashworth, your rings might slip." The momentary brush of sleeves, the subtle rotation of saucers. In the drawing-room, Miss Marbella recreated the moment. Lady Clarissa's cup, originally before Lord Reginald's place. Miss Vane's trembling hand, switching them under guise of chivalry. But why would the heiress? The detective stilled. Unless both cups had been poisoned. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Saucer. The grandfather clock in Ashworth Manor's hall chimed thrice, its somber tones swallowed by the oppressive silence of the storm-locked house. Miss Marbella sat alone in the morning-room, her untouched breakfast congealing on a spode plate. Before her lay 3 artifacts, the serrated key, the cyanide ampule, and a sugar cube impaled on a silver tong. Outside, rain lashed the windows like 1,000 accusing fingers. 2 poisons, 2 motives, 2 lipstick stains. The detective's mind traced the permutations. Lady Clarissa, armed with stolen cyanide, could have laced her husband's cup, but why then drink it herself? Miss Vane, desperate to eliminate her lover's wife, might have switched the cups, yet her trembling hands suggested a novice's fear, not a killer's resolve. And what of the arsenic, sitting uselessly in Mrs. Price's rat-infested cellar? A knock startled the silence. Miss Vane hovered in the doorway, her morning dress buttoned askew. "Might I confide in you, Miss Marbella?" Her voice quavered like a plucked harp string. "Of course, my dear." The detective gestured to a chintz armchair. "Though I warn you, confessions carry weight in a house of ghosts." The heiress sank into the cushions, her story spilling out in fits and starts. Lord Reginald's promises of marriage once his tiresome wife was gone. The Titian sale meant to appease Miss Vane's debt-collecting father. But when I tried to end it last week, she whispered, Reggie threatened to publish my letters. I've been a pawn between them. Miss Marbella noted the girl's chipped nail polish, the raw redness where a ring had recently been wrenched from her finger. And the teacup? I only switched them to protect him, Miss Vane blurted. Lady Clarissa kept staring at Reggie's cup. I thought she'd poisoned it. But when I swapped them, she drank anyway, and— A sob choked her words. The detective's spine straightened. She switched them to save Reginald, not kill Clarissa. A critical miscalculation. Rising, she pressed a handkerchief into the girl's hand. Stay here. Bolt the door. In the study, Lord Reginald Ashworth nursed a brandy snifter, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the fake Titian. She hated this painting, he slurred as Miss Marbella entered. Funny, isn't it? The copy's better than the original. Like your marriage, the detective observed. The lord's laughter curdled. Clarissa was all veneer. The dowry? Gone by 93. The mines? Played out. But the world saw gilt edges and grace. He gulped liquor. She knew about Penelope. Said she would let me rot in debtor's prison unless I played the doting husband. Miss Marbella drifted to the ledger still open on the desk. Yet you sold the Titian to pay Miss Vane's father. Why? Because Clarissa's new will left everything to Dr. Hale. Reginald hurled his glass at the hearth. That quack's been her puppet since he botched my treatment last winter. They plan to have me committed. The detective's gaze fell upon a paperweight, a hunk of Cornish tin ore. The Ashworth family crest etched into its base matched the serrated key's teeth. And the cyanide in her dressing room? Reginald froze. Cyanide? I thought she used— He caught himself, but not before Miss Marbella noted the slip. Thought she used what? The answer materialized in the conservatory, where Dr. Hale dissected a begonia with surgical precision. You told Lady Clarissa about Reginald's affair, Miss Marbella began, watching a petal fall like a drop of blood. She already knew. The physician's scalpel stilled. What she didn't know was that Miss Vane's child is mine. The revelation hung between them, sharp as the blade in his hand. My sister's daughter, Dr. Hale continued, raised by the Vanes after her death. When Reginald seduced Penelope, history repeated itself. Clarissa promised to disinherit him if you certified his insanity, Miss Marbella finished. But why keep cyanide? For mercy. The doctor met her gaze. When the money ran out, Clarissa planned a joint suicide. She'd stage their deaths, I'd revive her, and she'd inherit as the grieving widow. His fist clenched around the scalpel, but I refused to play executioner. A gust rattled the glass panes. Somewhere in the house, a door slammed. Miss Marbella found Mrs. Price in the smoking room, her knitting replaced by a cigarillo. You have been busy, the dowager sneered. Unraveling threads better left tied. Threads have a way of tangling murderers, the detective replied, eyeing the woman's jet brooch, an exact match to Molly's missing garnet. Mrs. Price blew a smoke ring. Clarissa stole my husband too once. Men are moths to her flame. She stubbed out the cigarillo. But arsenic's too vulgar for revenge. I prefer watching empires burn. As the dowager swept out, Miss Marbella knelt by the fireplace. Among the ashes lay a half-charred scrap of stationery. Ensure the exchange occurs before tea. R will take blame. The clock chimed 5. Somewhere, a cup shattered. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Whiskey. The storm's wrath had dwindled to a spectral drizzle by dawn, leaving Ashworth Manor's windows streaked like tear-stained cheeks. Miss Marbella stood in the dim library, her fingers trailing over the spines of leather-bound ledgers. The faint scent of brandy and regret clung to the air, a testament to Lord Reginald's nocturnal brooding. Spread before her were the puzzle pieces of malice: the arsenic receipt, the cyanide ampoule, and the charred scrap of stationery hinting at a planned blame game. 2 poisons, 2 lipsticks, 2 betrayals. A muffled argument seeped through the walls. Miss Marbella followed the sound to the billiard room, where Lord Reginald loomed over Dr. Hale, his breath reeking of desperation and spirits. "You think I don't know about your experiments?" he snarled, shaking the cyanide ampule like a gambler's last die. "Clarissa's dressing room reeked of your hypocrisy." Dr. Hale's composure cracked. "Hypocrisy? You drove my sister to her grave, then preyed on her daughter." His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "But I didn't kill Clarissa. She was already dying, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The cyanide was her exit strategy once she'd ruined you." Miss Marbella stepped into the room, her shadow stretching long in the gaslight. "And the arsenic, Lord Ashworth? A clumsy attempt to implicate Mrs. Price?" The nobleman's jowls quivered. "I bought nothing. That receipt is a forgery." "Is it?" The detective produced a ledger entry dated the same day as the arsenic purchase. A withdrawal of £50 from Lord Reginald's dwindling accounts. "Your signature, I believe." Silence pooled like spilled ink. In the conservatory, Miss Vane huddled beneath a moth-eaten shawl, her eyes hollow. "He told me she was ill," she murmured when Miss Marbella approached. "Reggie said we only had to wait a few months. But when I saw her that morning, vibrant as ever," her voice broke, "I thought he had lied to keep me hopeful." Miss Marbella noted the heiress's chapped lips. "No lipstick today. You switched the cups to protect him, yet Lady Clarissa drank willingly. Why?" "Because she knew." Miss Vane's whisper trembled. When I reached for Reggie's cup, she smiled. That awful, triumphant smile. She wanted me to do it. The detective's mind flashed to the 2 lipstick stains, Clarissa's signature crimson and Miss Vane's peach gloss. Both on the same cup. A staged struggle? A farewell performance? Mrs. Price intercepted Miss Marbella in the portrait gallery, her cane tapping a dirge on the marble. "You tread dangerous waters, madam. The Ashworths devour those who dig too deep." "As they devoured your husband?" The detective paused before a painting of a young Clarissa, her smirk immortalized in oils. The dowager's knuckles whitened on her cane. "He gambled away our fortune chasing her favor. When I confronted her, she laughed. 'Men are perishable goods,' she said." Mrs. Price's smile was blade sharp. "But arsenic? Too pedestrian. I preferred watching her choke on her own hubris." At twilight, Miss Marbella convened the household in the drawing-room. The tea-table, reset with forensic precision, gleamed under candlelight. "Let us reconstruct the final act," she declared, placing Lady Clarissa's cup at its original position, directly before Lord Reginald's seat. "Dr. Hale," she began, "you supplied the cyanide. Knowing Clarissa's terminal diagnosis, she intended to stage a suicide, framing Lord Reginald posthumously for her murder, thus nullifying his inheritance." The physician nodded grimly. "But I refused to administer it. She must have taken matters into her own hands." "Indeed." Miss Marbella lifted the fatal cup. She laced her husband's tea, expecting him to collapse. But Miss Vane, believing Reginald's cup poisoned, switched them. She rotated the saucer, revealing twin lipstick rings. Clarissa, ever the puppeteer, let her. She drank the cyanide willingly, ensuring Miss Vane would hang for the switch, while her revised will left everything to Dr. Hale, avenging his sister. Lord Reginald's chair screeched as he stood. Preposterous. If she meant to die, why involve Penelope? Because dying by another's hand invalidates the life insurance, Miss Marbella replied, but a suicide nullifies it entirely. Unless, she placed the charred stationery scrap on the table. Ensure the exchange occurs before tea. R will take blame. Clarissa's true mark wasn't you, Lord Ashworth. The detective turned to Dr. Hale. It was Miss Vane. By framing her for the switch, Clarissa ensured Reginald's lover would hang, while her will rewarded you for your silence. A final twist of the knife. Miss Vane's scream echoed through the manor. Dr. Hale lunged for Lord Reginald, and in the chaos, Miss Marbella slipped a sugar cube into her pocket, untainted, yet bitter with truth. Chapter 5. The Unraveling Thread. Ashworth Manor's Grand Hall thrummed with the aftermath of revelation. Miss Vane's scream had dissolved into hysterical sobs, Lord Reginald's face had turned the color of spoiled custard, and Dr. Hale stood motionless as a cadaver awaiting dissection. Only Mrs. Price seemed unperturbed, her knitting needles clicking a sardonic counterpoint to the chaos. Miss Marbella, a quiet storm in lace gloves, observed the wreckage of facades with the patience of a gardener pruning roses. "Lies!" Lord Reginald bellowed, hurling a candlestick at the reconstructed tea table. Clarissa couldn't engineer such a scheme. Couldn't she? Dr. Hale's voice cut cold as a scalpel. She diagnosed her own cancer 6 months ago, told me she'd make her exit a masterpiece. The physician turned to Miss Marbella, his professional detachment crumbling. But I never imagined she'd use Penelope as her brushstroke. Miss Vane moaned into her hands. She knew about the baby. Said Reggie's brat would never inherit Ashworth dirt. Mrs. Price snorted. Dirt's all that's left. The mines, the paintings, the lies. Her jet brooch glinted as she leaned toward Miss Marbella. You have missed the frame, dear. Every masterpiece needs one. The detective's gaze drifted to the fake Titian. A copy better than the original. She crossed the room, lifted the painting from its hooks, and revealed a wall safe behind it. The serrated key from Lady Clarissa's dressing case slid into the mechanism with a satisfying click. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a sealed vial labeled Strychnine. The journal's pages exhaled the scent of violet ink and vindictiveness. Miss Marbella read aloud in the study, her audience held captive by their own complicity. March 12th. Reginald's whore breeds. Let her swell with hope. The fall will be exquisite. April 3rd. Secured Hale's cyanide. His sister's ghost makes him pliable. April 19th. Price's arsenic purchase. Delightfully crude. The rats will feast until the blame does. Lord Reginald sank into a chair. She documented her own downfall? Miss Marbella turned a page, or magnum opus. Listen. May 1st. The tea must be perfect. R's cup to his lips, mine to my triumph. Let the vain girl think herself clever. When the cyanide claims me, her guilt will hang prettier than any necklace. Dr. Hale palmed the strychnine vial. Why this? Cyanide's quicker. A contingency. Miss Marbella opened the journals. Final entry. May 7th. If Hale grows a conscience, the strychnine in his bag will answer. Convulsions make compelling evidence, the physician recoiled. She meant to frame me for Reginald's murder. While ensuring Miss Vane took the blame for hers, Miss Marbella concluded. A double tableau. Dusk draped the manor in shadows as the detective paced the terrace. Below, Constable Briggs interrogated Molly, the maid's tears glistening in lantern light. I only moved the cups as her ladyship ordered. Said it was a game. Miss Marbella's breath fogged the night air. A game with pawns and poisons. She retraced the tea service in her mind, the placement of spoons, the angle of saucers, Lady Clarissa's insistence on using her grandmother's Rockingham china. Rockingham. In the butler's pantry, the detective examined the teacups, floral gilt, crimson crests, and in Lady Clarissa's cup, an almost imperceptible hairline crack. Holding it to a lamp, she discerned a residue in the fissure. Not cyanide. Arsenic. Mrs. Price materialized like a spectre, double-layered like her soul. Poison in the crack, poison in the tea. The first dose would have killed Reginald slowly. The second, herself, dramatically. The Dowager smirked. Clarissa adored backup plans. But why involve the arsenic at all? Miss Marbella mused. Misdirection, dear. The cyanide was her finale, but the arsenic, Mrs. Price tapped the cracked cup, was my contribution. A final toast to dead husbands. Midnight found Miss Marbella in the cellar, her lamp illuminating crates of Bordeaux and a rusted strongbox. Inside lay letters between Lady Clarissa and a Parisian art forger, instructions to replicate the Titian after its sale. To maintain appearances, Miss Marbella murmured, but one phrase snagged her attention. Payment upon confirmed demise. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. Dr. Hale descended, a revolver glinting in his hand. She thought of everything, didn't she? Except her opponent's humanity. Miss Marbella faced him calmly. You moved the strychnine from your bag after finding the journal. The physician's arm trembled. I won't hang for her madness. Reginald deserves punishment, not me. And Miss Vane's child? The detective stepped closer. Will it grow up orphaned by the same pride that destroyed your sister? The gun clattered to the stone floor. Dr. Hale crumpled, his sobs echoing through the wine-dark dark. Chapter 6. The Final Steep. The drawing-room of Ashworth Manor lay steeped in the pallid light of dawn, the same claw-footed table now a stage for reckoning. Miss Marbella stood at its head, Lady Clarissa's journal open like a grimoire of malice. The surviving players encircled her. Lord Reginald slumped in his chair, Dr. Hale rigid as a sentinel, Miss Vane trembling beneath a shawl, and Mrs. Price smirking into her lace handkerchief. Even Constable Briggs hovered in the doorway, his boyish bravado replaced by awe. A tragedy in 3 acts, Miss Marbella began, her voice as crisp as starched linen. First, the arsenic. She placed Mrs. Price's receipt on the table, purchased not for rats, but to resurrect an old grudge. You laced Lady Clarissa's favorite cup years ago, knowing its crack would slowly poison her. The Dowager's eyes glittered. A woman's vengeance is a patient brew. Yet Lady Clarissa discovered it, the detective continued. Rather than confront you, she repurposed your pettiness. She allowed the arsenic to weaken her, knowing her terminal diagnosis would mask the symptoms. A perfect alibi for her eventual murder. Dr. Hale stiffened. She told me the pain was from the cancer. And so it was, until she chose to weaponize it. Miss Marbella turned to Lord Reginald. Your financial ruin left her desperate. Selling the Titian was never about debts. It funded a forgery to fake the painting's theft, creating a motive for your murderous rage. The Lord's jowls quivered. I never touched that damned painting. No, but her journal details instructions to her solicitor. Upon her death, the forgery would be discovered in your possession, damning you as a fraud. Miss Marbella lifted the Parisian art dealer's letter. A masterpiece of posthumous revenge. Miss Vane's whimper sliced the air. And the cyanide? Her crescendo. The detective opened the journal to its final entry. She dosed your cup, Lord Reginald, knowing Miss Vane's devotion would compel her to switch them. When she drank the poison herself, her death would appear a murder, by your hand, Miss Vane, with the switched cup as evidence. The heiress pressed a hand to her belly, but the baby was never Lord Reginald's. Miss Marbella nodded to Dr. Hale. Your child, conceived in a moment of pity for your orphaned niece. Lady Clarissa learned the truth and threatened to expose it, ensuring your cooperation in certifying Reginald's insanity. The physician's mask slipped, revealing raw grief. I refused. So she made me a pawn anyway. Precisely. Miss Marbella placed the strychnine vial beside the journal. Had you interfered, this would have been found in your bag, implicating you in Reginald's murder. Her plot wove everyone's secrets into a noose. Lord Reginald lurched to his feet. And what of her? She dies a saint while we rot. No? Miss Marbella closed the journal with finality. She dies a tyrant undone by her own script. The arsenic? Mrs. Price's slow justice. The switched cup? Miss Vane's love outmaneuvering cruelty. The forged Titian? She nodded to Constable Briggs, who revealed the original painting from behind a screen. Retrieved from the Parisian dealer, who confessed under threat of scandal. Mrs. Price chuckled darkly. Clarissa always hated happy endings. There are none here, Miss Marbella said. Only truths. She turned to each in turn. Lord Reginald will face debtor's prison. Miss Vane and Dr. Hale shall raise their child far from this rot. Mrs. Price? The dowager arched a brow. Your arsenic confession will grace the morning papers. And Lady Clarissa's legacy? The detective gestured to the journal, its pages curling like ash. A cautionary tale of vanity's poison. As the constable led the players away, Miss Marbella lingered at the tea table. She righted Lady Clarissa's overturned cup, the crack in its glaze catching the light. So much ruin in such a small thing. On the terrace, dawn bled across the gardens. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, a nightingale sang, a sweet, fleeting counterpoint to the manor's decay. Miss Marbella breathed in the damp air, her mind already turning toward St. Mary Allen's quieter mysteries. But for now, she honored the silence, steeped in the bitter tea of human folly.